What does it mean to be humbled? Perhaps it's to lose some pride, to feel less important, even a little defeated. From the Latin humus, soil, to be brought down to earth, to bite the dust, to be laid low. In that sense, maybe a humbling can never actually be welcomed in as great. We would never wish for this encounter with mortality on a planetary scale, but here we are. If this is a humbling, then maybe it's about a regrounding, a reconnection in which we are being made to stare into the dark mirror and reflect on the reflection we see staring back at us. Perhaps there's a message in that image. My name's Ed Gillespie, and myself and my co-host Dougal Hine have spent the last 20 years trying to decipher and articulate that message. How will they look in hindsight, these strange times we are living through? Is this a midlife crisis on humanity's road to the Star Trek future, or the point at which that story of the future unravelled and we came to see how much it had left out? What if our current crises are neither an obstacle to be overcome, nor the end of the world, but a necessary humbling? In the early weeks of the coronavirus crisis and the extraordinary rupture of the everyday that it represents, we set out to explore what it means to be humbled.
Here we are, episode 8. Our weekly production cycle was so tight and well behaved during the early part of the series, and then it seems to have somehow trailed off. But no, we should say a little bit. I mean, here we are. We're recording at night, Ed, as our children sleep in their respective bedrooms in different countries. Here in Sweden, my family, we've just come through the valley of the shadow of the virus. In fact, when we recorded episode 7, I don't know if you noticed this, but I was starting to fade out a bit. I was just getting ill, and we're all just over 2 weeks later fully recovered, it seems, not taking anything for granted. Because of my partner's job, she was tested last week, so we know that it was the coronavirus that we've had. And I mean, physically we've been pretty lucky compared to lots of people, obviously, but it was striking the kind of the sense of really crawling uphill of the days after feeling properly ill that actually felt like a really unusual journey back. But it's also, I've been saying this when people have asked me about it, normally when you come down with some weird bug, it hasn't been the top news story every day, everywhere in the world for the past 3 months. It hasn't been deemed serious enough that, everything's ground to a halt in response to it. So that lays this whole other kind of psychological weight on top of the physical experience of being ill that I guess anyone who has been through this over the last few months will be able to relate to in one way or another. So yeah, that's me. That's my excuse for why it's been a while since we last recorded an episode. But Ed, how about you?
I think it's interesting, Dougal, that it was episode 7, the cultivation of conspiracy, in which we tried to breathe together, that you were beginning to struggle for breath as you went down with COVID. Yeah, I mean, it's been an extraordinary couple of weeks for me too, actually. What I would describe as both a gift and a humbling, without going into sort of dramatic personal details. But I rather suddenly, and not entirely unexpectedly, but became a single parent to my 3-year-old daughter during lockdown, when I won interim custody. So I've been sort of thrust into all the joys and challenges of parenting on a 24/7 basis with a gorgeous 3-year-old daughter, but without sort of any preparation, no adjustment, no transmission, no support, basically thrown in at the deep end. And it's been magical, but obviously eye-opening as well as heart-opening. And so the working day now begins at 8:30 p.m. at night, once the offspring are safely in their beds. And I have actually, on my other podcast, had to warn them at the start of one recording, saying, if she does appear, I'm off. That's because that's what I'm going to prioritize. it's also enabled us a bit more space, perhaps to reflect for this final episode of series 1. And it allowed me to kind of just, go back over the journey that we've covered since late March, which has been quite an extraordinary few weeks, as we all know. But from that first episode where we were trying to see where the emerging sense making around the stories was going, this sort of mapping of lava. And I don't think we're much further along that. I still think we're stuck in a lot of these competing narratives. And then we asked that question, can we afford an economic recovery? This idea that the machine stops, and the contrasting idea of a paradise built in hell, which actually I've seen prop up several times in several other places since. So it was interesting that we'd stumbled upon those quite early on in our own wanderings. Then, of course, there was a sort of the colourful search for a language of longing, this reconnection back to a rewilded world, and which led us seamlessly into the bestiary of metaphors, perhaps one of the more playful episodes, episode 4. And then the last 3, I think, saw us getting into some really meaty territory. Episode 5 of The World Turned Upside Down, the inversion of so much of normality, the role of culture, and the depth of culture, and our exploration around the respective situations in Sweden compared to the UK, which again seems really, really prescient now when we're realizing that the UK pretty much has the worst record in the world, in terms of the death rates per capita. And then episode 7 with that, as I said, the cultivation of conspiracy, where we're just trying to understand what is drawing people in to these perhaps more outre narratives or ways of seeing and understanding. I think that brings us to a really interesting point for this, how's your humbling final episode? So where we usually go now is ask our traditional question, what have you been reading that's made you think? And now you've had a bit longer, Dougal, and I guess during your convalescence, hopefully there was some time for it. So what's been heating your iron?
Well, do you remember David Fell from episode 5, The World Turned Upside Down, who wrote that piece that I loved so much that I read about half of it out? 11 things so far. He was talking about the Victorian vicars producing all those extraordinary inventions and works of scholarship, and how having to speak in front of a room full of ordinary people every Sunday kept them grounded. And well, he sent me a new piece, 11 more things, which kind of picks up where that one left off. And part of why I wanted to talk about this is because I really feel at this end of the series need to talk about how being humbled, one of the things it means is being brought to the ground. I want to talk about how we ground these conversations, the threads that we've been following over the past couple of months, so that they're not left hanging just as beautiful abstractions or lovely language floating in the air, but that they're really tied to the mess and the difficulty and all of the shit of the moment that we're in and the things that have been revealed over this time. So in this new piece, it starts with him remembering being a teenager, washing cars on a Saturday at a second-hand car sales room. And there's a guy a couple of years older than him who he's working with, who's asking him, well, what do you do the rest of the week? And he says, well, I'm studying maths and physics and economics for my A-levels. And the guy looks at him for a few moments and he says, what, like home economics? and it reminds me of like conversations with people I grew up around in Darlington, or people I worked with in warehouses and call centres and sales jobs that I ended up doing in my 20s after I'd trashed my career at the BBC. Or actually, I thought of this girl who I tutored in a Bangladeshi family in Sheffield who was 15 and she was doing her GCSEs, and she'd been away. The family had been back in Bangladesh for half a year and she was struggling with her English, and I was tutoring her because she lived around the corner from me. I have this really strong memory. It was the year when the tsunami happened. And obviously, Bangladesh was one of many countries in Asia that had been really badly affected. And so it had been all over the news. It had been in lots of conversations that her family were having. And I just realized when I was talking with her that she had heard this word, tsunami. She knew it meant something big and terrible. But no one had actually explained to her what the word meant. And so what we started doing each week in our tutoring sessions was like spending part of the time just talking about words that she'd heard and didn't know what they meant, and just unpacking them and building up vocabulary. And so the question that David's asking really in this piece is, like, what story, what language can we use to talk about where we find ourselves, what's been revealed, what's called for, what could happen next, that has a chance of being a common starting point and doesn't assume you need to have studied PPE in order to take part in or make sense of the conversation. And he gets to this simple statement: we must look after our key workers. Key workers, it's kind of back to Sergey Samuel's point about this thing that's been revealed about the essential versus the non-essential workers, this remapping of which jobs matter. And so David's talking about this. He says, there are ways of identifying the things that really need doing. And these things that really need doing need to be done by people who we can call key workers. If we don't look after them, we're in deep shit. There'll be no food, or no power, or no money, or no houses, or no healthcare, or no families. And there certainly won't be any of the comforts and luxuries we've come to expect. So what if the conversation starts like this? Do you remember that time in 2020 when everything nearly fell apart? When all those people died and the only people who kept things going were all those key workers? We must look after our key workers. And it's the thing I was talking about in Brussels last year that came up in one of the episodes. This, how much of the activity that makes up the economy could just stop and none of us would really miss it. And the other side of that is, which are the bits of the activity that are key? And then this idea that you can build a political consensus that rests on that simple statement. How can we be looking after our key workers if our housing system is fucked? How can we be looking after our key workers if the school system is inadequate? How can we be looking after our key workers if we pay them a pittance, or oblige them to work 0-hour contracts, or condemn them to a diet of high fat, high salt, high sugar, ultra processed foods? And it's like you can build out so much, but you have to start not with your pet idea, but with something that is true and makes sense and can be, that you can imagine a conversation going on around in any pub or post office or school staff room or garage, where as things begin to get back to whatever version of normal they get back to, people are talking to each other about all of this. It's all about storytelling, really, isn't it?
I think that's really, I think that takes me back to a lot of the things that I've wrestled with, but perhaps we've both wrestled with in terms of the storytelling. I mean, weirdly, I had a dream last night following the recording of my other podcast where we were talking about climate change and the storytelling, or the failure of the storytelling, if you like, over the 20 years in regard to that. And I have to hold my hands up because I've been partly responsible for some of that storytelling. And in the dream last night, it was a sort of slightly ranty dream, but I was sort of arguing with myself, and there were probably raised voices, but it was this sort of sense of exasperation. It was why can't people see this? Why can't people understand? Why can't people engage, relate, connect to this thing which is so palpably obvious and powerful and poignant and problematic for me, and which I can see with such clarity, and yet this is not landing with others. Their filters, their defenses, their barriers, and it was the dream left me with that kind of that sense of discombobulation and also a frustration. It was like, and I remember in the dream I was sort of my argument is like, why does this always have to be spun? Why does it have to be framed? Why does it have to be, positioned in such a way that it becomes palatable or acceptable to people? And I guess this was probably a kind of a distilled, concentrated form of what I've been experiencing for a long time. But yeah, I woke up not quite in a cold sweat, but it was one of those dreams where you wake up tired. Where you feel like that wasn't a nice restful restorative sleep. That was a processing sleep, where there was deep work going on. But yeah, and I think what you're saying about storytelling, I mean, having tried to craft narratives, particularly around climate, for a very long time, I've been really ruminating on two great examples of storytelling for very different reasons, which I think are relevant to our sort of humbling exploration. And the first is quite a famous short story by Ursula Le Guin, the sci-fi writer. Although to pigeonhole her as a sci-fi writer is not strictly fair. And it's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And if people don't know the story, I mean, the gist of it is Omelas is this prosperous, very convivial, in Illich's terms, type of place, a very pleasant place to live, full of nice markets and, street carnivals, and everyone's connected and happy, and has a wonderful sense of solidarity and shared endeavor, and everything about it feels quite wonderful, until you have this realization that there's a sort of Faustian pact which underpins the prosperity of the place, which is based on the fact that in order for it to happen, a small child has to be kept in absolutely sort of grim penury in a dark cell underneath the city. And there's a sort of coming of age moment where every citizen in the city is told about this pact. And most of them accept that, the utilitarian argument of the benefits for the largest number of people is somehow justifies the suffering of this one small child. But the point that Le Guin makes in the story, and it's a very short story, it's only about 7 or 8 pages, is the ones who walk away, because there are a small number of people who just cannot accept that. So there's that refusal to live with the utilitarian compromise, which is built on unbearable suffering, the impossibility of real true happiness within that, the rejection of what is obviously a flawed utopia, and that sense of complicity, and I always go back to the fact that obviously we live in a spectrum of different Omelas type scenarios, depending on who we are and where we are. We may not cruelly imprison a child, but there are multiple known hideousnesses.
Yeah, I mean, there's how much slavery do our lifestyles depend on? If you think that the answer is none, then you're in denial. And there's so much stuff there that we maybe get glimpses of through some of the things about the supply chain that have come up in this crisis, but back to normal is back to what hasn't really gone away, all of the things that we do not like to think about, without which our lives and lifestyles and societies are not possible.
I know. I remember watching the movie 13th Amendment a couple of years ago, which had the kind of, and this is very, very topical in terms of the US right now, but there are more people of color involved in forced labor in the US penitentiary system now than there were working on plantations in the era of slavery.
Right.
So even just quantitatively, you could argue there's no progress. No justice, no peace. And that sort of goes back to something we've touched on, in terms of climate, in terms of COVID, and, in terms of civil rights and injustice. It's like none of us are safe until all of us are safe. And I think the other aspect that comes from Omelas is something Jonathan Porritt you say, it was like, do we all sup with the devil, but some of us just choose to use a very long spoon, and then what does it really mean to walk away from Omelas? Is the metaphor actually not about abandonment, but an embracing of uncertainty, to not actually know where we might go? Because that's what Le Guin sort of intimates. She says, who do we know where they go? Those who walk away from Omelas, to not have a plan, but for the discontinuation of the status quo to be enough, to wander in hope beyond grief.
To walk away without any security of knowing, but just because you can't do otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, and it's an incredibly powerful idea, and it is, I think it's so relevant in these times now, where the fear of uncertainty leads to the knee-jerk familiarity that we've touched on in other episodes, where we go back to the status quo. Even if we're building back better, we're building back in the same mode. So that's part of the problem. And then the other story I've really been ruminating on is a book which I read a few years ago by Ernest Callenbach called Ecotopia, and it's actually a book I was weirdly sent anonymously as a gift, and I've still to this day don't know who sent it to me, but it arrived in the post one day, and I duly read it, and it's a book written in 1975, and it's an imperfect, in process utopian novel, which essentially, in a nutshell, is about the west coast of America seceding from the Union, basically Northern California, Oregon and Washington, after a brief civil war, break away and form a kind of independent state based on ecological principles. It was quite influential on many aspects of 70s and 80s environmentalism. You can sense a bit of the Stuart Brand Whole Earth catalogue type of stuff in there. But it's interesting, one of the reasons quoted in the book for this breakaway state was people were literally sick of bad air, chemicalized food and lunatic advertising. And that was in 1975. So, if Callenbach could see us now, and he said, it's so hard to imagine anything fundamentally different from what we have now. But without these alternate visions, we get stuck on dead center. We better get ready. We need to know where we'd like to go. And I think that contrasts really uncomfortably in a way with the Le Guin thing. Do we? Or can we actually know where we always need to go? And I think in some ways, what sticks with me in terms of the storytelling, which I think appeals to the common sense point that we're trying to get down to, this sort of grounded root of a story that might connect with many folk, is this sort of combination of handicraft and spacecraft. There's something quite clever at the heart of Ecotopia, where technology is not an answer, it's a question, and it's only deployed where it genuinely adds value and adheres to the principles of the nation. And Ecotopia, considering it was written in the mid-70s, is weirdly pressing on video conferencing. I mean, the technology is very, very Zoom-like all over the place. And it has principles of urban ecology and food production, the circular economy, construction out of natural materials, huge emphasis on leisure time, emotionally expressive people, gender roles. I mean, very California, 1975. The New York Times actually described it as the novel that predicted Portland. But in terms of our question about humbling, I've found The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas a much more compelling piece of storytelling in terms of the discomfort that the questions it left me with, was more powerful. Whereas I really like Ecotopia, and it is a book I've gone back to several times. But actually, on reflection, it's not very humble. it's a little bit pleased with itself, and the fact that, hey, we sorted this, guys. We got it all fixed, and isn't it great? And you guys left in the rest of America and the rest of the world are on the wrong side of the wall. You're on the wrong side of the argument.
Well, okay, here's another piece of storytelling that has completely, caught me in the last week. I can't think of much that I have read during the time we've been making this podcast that's more powerful than this post from Alan Lane, who is the artistic director of Slung Low, which is a theatre company that relocated a few years ago to the Holbeck, which is the oldest working men's club in Britain, in the Holbeck area of Leeds. And he's written this post about their experience of being the ward lead in council speak for social care referrals in their part of the city over the past 10 weeks or so. And it really is a ground level picture of what lockdown looks like in terms of how it plays out in people's lives and the day-to-day needs that they've been responding to, picking up prescriptions, people topping up electric meters, putting out bins, teaching people to Zoom. At the heart of it, making sure that people get fed. It's a story about hunger and poverty and a mental health crisis, all of which was there already and has only intensified under the way that life has been changed for people over these 3 months. And part of what moved me about Alan's post is it reflects the best of what theatre people can sometimes be like. And I say this as an honorary theatre person myself, because I spent 2 years working with Riksteatern, the Swedish National Theatre here, and had the chance to get to know some very inspiring people doing very kind of ground level community sort of experimental theatre on the work that's sort of on the boundaries between theatre and social change and just finding different ways of being human together. And that's it for me. Like, theatre can be like beyond satire at times as a world, but at its best, it's also a world in which there's an approach to storytelling and being human together, learning different ways of being human together, learning how we embody stories. And that's what I admire so much in Alan's post is, on the one hand, just this active service to community that makes me feel very humble when I compare it to what I've been doing over the past 10 weeks, but also this ability to reflect on it with clarity and deep engagement. So, like, here's a bit of what he writes. The story we're telling is that no one in our community will have to go without food during this time. And the only way to tell that story well is to make it true. I'm going to read that line again. The story we're telling is that no one in our community will have to go without food during this time. And the only way to tell that story well is to make it true. And I guess, and you must have heard this, I have so much talk about, the importance of stories. We need a new story. We need new stories for dealing with climate change or whatever. And often that gets very kind of loose and fluffy. And this is, there's a moment here where it gets very, very real.
And that comes back to this point that hope comes from action, not the other way around. People always say, we need the hope in order to get us to act. It's like, no, it's the other way around. I mean, it's the doing that brings the hope.
It's a very unvarnished picture that Alan's offering, and it's very, there's almost a kind of George Orwell element to it, because it's just telling you, this is what's in a food package that's meant to last a week. Look at this food. This is clearly not a week's worth of food, but this is how things are. He's talking about working alongside the council, and through that coming to a better understanding of and respect for the front line of council staff, people who are absolutely those key workers that David Vale is talking about. And he talks about the most demoralizing moment in that process they've been through over the last 10 weeks, when this email comes around from high up at the city council saying that from now on, they're only to provide food parcels to people for a maximum of 4 weeks. at which point the recipients should have their benefits situation resolved by the DWP, and so they should stop providing assistance to people after 4 weeks. He says someone expresses it, there's a concern about people becoming reliant on food parcels. And part of what Alan talks about is the way that this transforms the story that they've been working and living to tell. It pulls it out from under them. He says, with this announcement, Leeds City Council transformed what we had considered to be civic mutual aid, leveraging waste in the food industry to resolve a problem of food availability and hunger, a collective act of citizenship by all of us here. They transformed it into an unpaid extension of a welfare system already demonstrated clearly to anyone paying attention as not fit for purpose. Our volunteerism, the resources of Slung Low and our supporters that had been put into this work was now co-opted to be a warm-up act for the benefits system with its administrations and morality. There's something so important here, I think, something that I feel like we were reaching towards back in episode 1, mapping out those different stories, talking about this disaster communism thing and how a division would open up over time between the role of the state on the one hand and the role of mutual aid on the other. Or maybe it's not that exactly. Maybe it's different attitudes to the role of the state. But all I know is that there's something essential about the role of relationships and mutuality and the spirit that Alan Lane is describing, and that's embodied in the story that they were working to tell, that if we're going to do a better job than it mostly looks like of riding out this great humbling that lies ahead of us, it's that kind of spirit and that kind of on the ground storytelling and making the story true that's going to have to be at the heart of it.
Yeah, completely. And I, the other thing I've been reading actually is totally relevant to that, which is Dutch historian Rutger Bregman's Humankind, because when you describe, that sort of people becoming reliant on food parcels, what that is describing is this sort of complicity that people can't be trusted not to become dependent on, as you say, what is a subsistence gift, which people could barely survive on. And in Humankind, Rutger has gone out of his way to argue that the assumption that people are inherently Hobbesian, that we need to be protected from the wild savagery of our primitive nature by authority, control and power, or our baser instincts will run amok. He's saying is actually fundamentally not true. And indeed, many of the famous sort of psychology experiments, such as the Stanford Prison Experiment and the Milgram Experiment, where people were administering, punitive, even fatal electric shocks, in theory, the results of those were manipulated or misrepresented. And it's like, it even goes so far as to sort of, question the whole of civilization, actually, in terms of the kind of the notion of barbarians, which, we can't have an episode where we don't reference Martin Shaw at least once. But, Martin's sort of grimoire of the School of Myth is all those barbarians. But there's a great passage from Humankind in which Rutger writes, why is our perception of barbarians so negative? Why do we automatically equate a lack of civilization with dark times? History, as we know, is written by the victors. The earliest texts abound with propaganda for states and sovereigns put out by oppressors seeking to elevate themselves while looking down on everybody else. The word barbarian was itself coined as a catch-all for anyone who didn't speak ancient Greek. That's how our sense of history gets flipped upside down. Civilization has become synonymous with peace and progress, and wilderness with war and decline. In reality, for most of human existence, it was the other way around. And there's a fantastic bit, he has some great stories in this book. So he sort of rejects William Golding's Lord of the Flies trope, which we all read in school, and is again seen.
Well, he finds this real life story, doesn't he, of what happened when a group of boys actually were marooned on an island for like over a year. It's extraordinary.
And they educated each other. They had, physical training. They've kind of set up a kitchen. I mean, it was the height of barbarianism in the best sense. And he also brings an immense new perspective to the Easter Island's alleged self-destruction, and essentially turns this whole orthodoxy on its head. I mean, it's a really gripping book and incredibly timely.
You've convinced me. I'm going to have to get hold of a copy. I read the extract about the Lord of the Flies, the real life version of it. I don't know how widely known it is, but William Golding, who wrote Lord of the Flies, is also the person who named the Gaia theory. So this, I won't do justice to it, but it's associated with James Lovelock, amongst others, this new science of Earth as a living system. But the story is that Golding and Lovelock were neighbours in this village in the southwest of England, and they used to go to the pub together and go on walks together. And on one of these walks, Lovelock's explaining this theory to Golding, and Golding, the novelist, goes, well, look, if you're going to come up with a big idea like that, you better give it a proper name. And Lovelock says, well, what do you suggest? He said, I suggest you call it Gaia. So we've got this Golding, amazing novelist, not very nice human being from some of the stories about him, but really interesting example of the way in which the story, the mythic figure of this goddess Gaia, is the kind of, well, Martin would call it the swan feather cloak that allows Lovelock's radical, heretical scientific theory to fly.
Yeah. I had no idea that they were buddies. That's quite extraordinary. So, Diggle, how do we bring this to some kind of conclusion? And perhaps conclusion is entirely the wrong word, but let's bring it to some kind of summation. That might be a better way of putting it, because you said at the beginning, what brings us back to the experience of a great humbling in practice. And I think what I've been asking is, have we been, or actually are we being humbled by this experience? It seems like in some ways our eyes are wider open now for key workers, inequality in the environment. I've been joking that we need to be de-Amazonizing business and re-Amazonizing nature. But that's probably just my weakness for straplines. But I was also struck by some of the kind of the more mainstream thinking that I've been engaged with as well, like things like the House of Beautiful Business, which I've mentioned before, where they were talking about the future of beautiful business, where their big event of the autumn was already going to be called the Great Wave. They were looking at these ideas of intimacy, playfulness, and surrender as the kind of the key themes for the Great Wave, because only those who let go have both hands free. And I had a fascinating conversation with them. It's like, well, is it a great tidal wave? Is it a tsunami? Is it a surf break? Or is it actually, with my geeky marine biology oceanographic hat on, what something might call a baroclinic Rossby wave, which is a wave which is a deep ocean wave, which moves imperceptibly through the ocean at a very, very slow pace, but is absolutely inexorable. And as it moves, it changes everything. And they think these are the waves which are, for example, the linking mechanism between different El Nino events.
Baroclinic Rossby.
Rossby waves, yes.
Wow.
So go and Google that. Baroclinic Rossby waves. So these are these are the deep currents. These are the deep stories, which we're only just beginning to comprehend. I also heard a talk from Lord Putnam, who just talked, he goes, we don't need a restoration of trust. We need a resurrection of trust. Trust is dead. And I think that's been brought to the fore, very painfully in so many ways, just in this last week. So this is an excavation, this is a resurrection. This is not just a restoration. This is something far more dramatic. And it feels like we need a combination of all of these things. The ecotopian vision, the courage to walk away from Omelas, the trust in human nature more. And just on a personal note, I feel,
I've referenced a couple of these bits here, and now I'm with my daughter. It's made me look back on the last 4 years in which, I lost my father and my brother, and had the grief of that. I lost my business, which was essentially a betrayal, and my relationship, which ended up in a terrible conflict. And so the last 4 years, in a way, has been an initiation for me. So when people talk about the challenges of this lockdown and what comes afterwards, the uncertainty, the lack of control, and then the contrasting gratitude for the simplicity of the things that really matter, I feel like I'd already been living that for years before this arrived. And so it's been fascinating to just ruminate on this with you. And I've been incredibly grateful for the experience of sharing these conversations over the last few weeks. And I just think, for me, it's about this humbling being a lesson which will be repeated until it is learned. And we're just at the start of this humbling.
Yeah, that's it. I remember you asking in the first episode, Ed, what's being revealed? That sense of the apocalyptic, meaning the unveiling, things being uncovered. And now we're at this point where, certainly when I talk to friends in the UK, or I was talking to somebody in France the other day, there's this kind of sense of the sighs of relief, stepping out into the sunshine, fragments of normality, and maybe the kind of intense all being in the cave initiatory thing that lots of people have talked about kind of dissipating. Is this a false dawn? Are we going to be back into another trough of the pandemic before long? Probably to a greater or lesser extent. But also, as things restart, it becomes so clear that the priority is restarting all the bits of life that involve money, while keeping restrictions on all of the bits that don't. And it reveals something ugly, but not untrue, about the reality of our way of living and the way our societies are structured, something that was there, before the virus kind of came out of nowhere and knocked us all sideways a few months ago. It becomes sort of harder to ignore it in that way that you see the prioritization of the decisions about reopening. And what's been revealed is the damage as well. I mean, not least, and this is something we've hardly touched on in this series, the revelation of the damaged condition of what are meant to be, at least according to the story that they tell, the world's richest, most developed societies. And just what an absolute shit show. The response from many parts of Europe and obviously from the US has been compared to countries that are still often referred to as if they are kind of developing or emerging or whatever. And it feels like the extent to which the map has been redrawn away from the way that those of us in Northern Europe and North America like to draw the map of the world, that's been revealed by the way that this has played out. And what we're seeing in America this week, what Alan Lane's talking about in Leeds, what's revealed about gender and the way that women end up bearing so much the brunt of the disruption that's been brought by the pandemic over the past months, the way that Black and minority ethnic people end up being massively disproportionately represented in those who are in hospital and dying from this. These are all, there's so much that's been revealed that it wasn't a secret before, but it maybe in some ways is made harder to ignore, harder to tolerate. And then there's these words from this Inuit artist, Takalik Partridge. Think about the way that the pandemic is only a warning shot, a first taste of the real storm that's ahead. So yeah, here we are. It's the end of this first series, and just as I started listing those things out, I realized how many things we've hardly touched on yet. A few weeks ago, I quoted that bit from King Lear. Is this the promised end or image of that horror? Now I'm thinking of Churchill. And this is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. Thank you for listening to this first series of The Great Humbling and joining us on this journey. Thanks especially to all of you who have been in touch, who've sent us things to read, who've shared these episodes on social media, or helped to spread the links we've shared to thinkers and writers and activists who've inspired us along the way. We're going to take some time out now, time to reflect, to pick up the threads of other projects and conversations, but we'll be back with Series 2 later in the year. Meanwhile, if you're looking for more food for thought, then check out Ed's other podcast, John Richardson and the Futurenauts, How to Survive the Apocalypse. There's also Notes from Underground, the essay and podcast series around climate change that I made with Bella Caledonia. If you're looking for ways to get involved in the kind of conversations we're bringing together here, then check out aschoolcalledhome.org. And the best way to keep in touch with us is to follow our Facebook page, facebook.com/thegreathumbling. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for listening. Take care and be well.